Good morning, everyone. Happy Wednesday morning to you, and welcome back to Morning Musings. My name is Don K. Preston. I am the president of Preterist Research Institute of Ardmore, Oklahoma, and we're looking at the disciples' questions in Matthew 24. Jesus had just predicted the utter desolation of Jerusalem and the temple. Not one stone should be left standing on top of another. When the disciples heard that, they asked, "Tell us, when shall these things be? What shall be the sign of your coming and the end of the age?" Now, yesterday, we took a really quick, tour through the previous references in the book of Matthew, prior to Matthew 24, where Jesus spoke of his coming. Those passages provide the background, in addition to the Old Testament knowledge of the presence of the Lord. They provide the background for the disciples' understanding of the coming of the Lord. And in every one of those references, it's delimited to that generation, to the first century generation. There's just simply no way out of that. So once again, the question is, since in every reference to the coming of the Lord, prior to Matthew chapter 24, every single one of those references has to do with the judgment of Jerusalem and Israel in the first century, then where would the disciples have ever gotten the idea that when Jesus predicted the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple, now, in total distinction from what he had already said to them in his ministry, now he's talking about the end of time. He's talking about the earth burning up. He's talking about the end of the Christian age. More on that later. Now, I told you yesterday that we would begin talking about the end of the age, but I do want to drive home the point a little bit more about this Greek word parousia. Now, let me be very clear. Once again, I understand, I acknowledge, I teach that the Greek word parousia can refer to an actual physical presence of a person. Paul uses it that way of his own personal appearance. That is not the question. The question is, how did the Old Testament, how did the contemporaries of Paul use that word when talking about the actions of deity? Now, here's something that you need to know. Kittle's Theological Dictionary of the New Testament. It's, I don't know if you can see that. No, oh, there it is up there. No, you can't see that. But one of the most in-depth, exhaustive lexicons, dictionaries of the Greek language. They point out that Josephus uses the Greek word parousia in his writings to speak of God's comings in the Old Testament. By the way, J.N.D. Kelly, a very noted church historian and scholar, likewise says that Josephus used the Greek word parousia to speak of God's comings in the Old Testament. Now, we've spent a good bit of time sharing with you about God's comings in the Old Testament, showing that not one of them referred to a literal, visible, physical, bodily coming of God. Now, what does this mean? This means that Josephus, who is a contemporary of Paul, a contemporary of Peter and James and etc., the New Testament writers, Josephus used the word parousia, the parousia of God, not to speak of any kind of a visible coming of God, but to speak of any time in which God acted within history, kind of like the day of the Lord, when the Lord put his sword into the hands of Nebuchadnezzar to destroy the Egyptians. When God used the Assyrians to destroy the Babylonians. When God used the Babylonians to destroy the Edomites. Those were the comings of the Lord. By the way, J.N.D. Kelly points out, it may be Witherington, excuse me, I'll have to double check that, I'm going purely on memory right here, points out that Josephus even uses the term power and parousia that Peter does in 2 Peter chapter 1, 16 and following, when Peter said, "We have not followed cunningly devised fables, when we made known to you the power and the parousia of the Lord Jesus Christ. So here is Peter referring to the power and the parousia of Christ. Josephus, his contemporary, uses the exact same phrase or term to describe God's actions in the Old Testament in a non-literal, non-visible, non-physical, non-bodily coming of the Lord. So I thought it necessary, I thought it important to give this background linguistic exercise, if you please, to help us to realize that when those who were conversant with the Old Testament and Hebraic thought, when they thought not necessarily of an individual, but of God's actions in history, they used parousia. Anytime God acted in history, like Jesus said he was going to, when he said he was going to come in the glory of the Father, he was going to come in judgment as he had seen the Father come. So, we have the Greek scholars, the Greek lexicons, we have Josephus. We have the entire body of the Old Testament references to the presence of the Lord, none of which referred to a literal, visible, bodily coming of the Lord. When you couple that with all of the earlier references to the coming of the Lord in the book of Matthew, none of which can refer to that kind of a coming, we are justified completely in asking, once again, where would the disciples have ever gotten the idea that when Jesus was predicting the destruction of Jerusalem, like the destruction of Jerusalem, only far worse, that took place in 586, that was called the Day of the Lord. It was the presence of the Lord. It was his coming on the clouds. It was his coming with the trumpets. So, the disciples knew about all that, so where would they have gotten the idea that when Jesus is predicting the fall of Jerusalem in Matthew 24, he's ignoring all of that background. He's ignoring all of the use of the language prior to that time. And he's talking about something radically different. I find no justification for that whatsoever. Now, as promised, we're going to begin looking tomorrow, Thursday, at the disciples' questions about what should be the sign of the end of the age. What did the disciples have in mind when they said, Lord, what shall be the sign of the end of the age? Boy, this is important. So we'll see you on the flip side. In the meantime, don't forget, get a copy of my book, We Shall Meet Him in the Air, The Wedding of the King of Kings. DonKPreston.com, BibleProphecy.com. Order the book and mention that you saw the offer on YouTube or Facebook, and I'll refund your shipping. Okay, I'll see you on the flip side.